right now. And there we go.
And now we're live. We're not going to make everybody sit through Space Invaders again, but we are now live. And so there wasn't really a countdown. We're just here all of a sudden, which is cool. So welcome everybody to the panel on wargaming. We are now live. On wargaming other than war. So the guy who said to make sure you mute your side monitors didn't mute his side monitor, and I apologize for that. That is the practical example of why you should follow your own advice. So today we have two panels back to back that we are trying to stay true to the ethos here at Connections Online and get outside of the normal space of wargaming that we kind of talk about. And so we are bringing in some folks from outside of our usual Connections crowd for a very specific purpose. We want to broaden that intellectual pool that we're pulling from for ideas here at Connections Online. Today, the panel we've assembled, the designers we've got, we'll introduce them all here in just a second, are all folks that have done wargaming other than war. These are all ideas and mechanics and tools and techniques that they've got in some pretty neat game designs that they've done that may be of use to you in the professional space for replicating or simulating or representing ideas that are not just straight kinetic combat. Like the blowing stuff up is cool, it's fun. Like that's how I got into wargaming and why I enjoy it. But there's a lot more to it, especially in the professional space, for things that we want to do. And so to that end, we've got Amabel Holland from Hollandspiel, we've got Kevin Bertram from Fort Circle Games, and we've got Cole Worley from Worley Games. And all of them have appeared in other places as well, but that's where they all currently are. So we're going to have them do about 10 minutes or so each talking about some of their specific projects and what's kind of cool and neat about them. And then we're going to open the floor to questions and let everybody kind of take over and pepper our audience here with questions. So Cole, the floor is yours. I'm going to disappear from camera and we're going to let you guys take the show.
All right. Thank you very much, Brant. And thanks to the convention for having me. Or us, I suppose. Let me share my screen here properly. We'll see if I can't do this as seamlessly as possible. Go. We'll see. Does this work? Okay. You see slides? Yes?
Yes.
All right. Good. Excellent. Thank you. Here we go. All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Cole Worley. I'm the creative director at Leader Games here in St. Paul, Minnesota, and the co-owner of Worley Games. And for my day job, I mostly work on hobby games that are fantasy games. Games like Root and Oath, which sort of take, they're kind of in the mainstream of the conflict side of hobby games. So these are games with dragons and caves and things like that. Soon to be spaceships. But I moonlight on the weekends. I do historical game design. And I've done a series of games. I'm really in the middle of a long series of games about the British Empire, and which is close to my own academic training. And so what I wanted to talk about today for the subject was to look at one game that I've done on the British East India Company, and in particular, how the game handles politics. So the game I'm going to be talking about is a game called John Company. It's originally published in 2017 by Sierra Madre Games. And it is a very, very large design. It covers about 150 years of the British East India Company, and it covers the East India Company from a economic, commercial, political, cultural, geopolitical angle. It's huge. It's a big sandbox design. Things that happen in the game, for instance, you watch the patchwork of states of the subcontinent in the long 18th century change, and it handles, the political relationships between the Maharathan territories and the kind of falling Mughal Empire. So it handles all that stuff. It handles treaties and war and the incursions of the British, and it's a massive, massive subject, and it's the kind of thing that you would normally write a book about, but I wanted to write a game about it because when I was doing research on this subject, I ran into a really fundamental problem, which is that the British East India Company didn't make any sense. Now, what I mean when I say that is usually when we're gaming a subject, when we're adapting a subject to a game, we commit a little sin right at the start, which is that we often, if we're operating at the strategic scale or the grand strategic, we will assume that a player is a lot like a country. And we're kind of falling into a sort of 19th century history practice that treats nations like people. Now, this is a very useful thing. If you're making a game about Germany in 1938, well, it's an understandable thing to say we're going to have one player represent that country in this circumstance. But it started breaking down when I looked at other subjects, because very often the primary actors of history are not individuals, they're groups of individuals, or they're individuals operating in a factional sense. And so when I was learning about the British East India Company, I kind of went into that story assuming that I would find a bunch of British greed, territorial ambition, the conquest of India, and then the birth of the British Empire. And all those things happen. But as I got closer to the history, I found that the East India Company was very often a conflicted institution. There were many different factions operating cross purposes. When Clive was victorious at Plassey and came back to London with taxing rights over a whole swath of Bengal, people weren't thrilled by it. And the reason people weren't thrilled is because the different people who made up the East India Company had very different ideas about what the East India Company could be. So I sort of performed the exercise that I always tell anyone I'm mentoring and design to do, which is I thought, who are the actors of the story? The first step of a game design like this is to figure out who the actors are and to figure out what they want. And I decided that the most interesting actors in the whole story of the British East India Company, they weren't the company itself, they weren't the British government, they were the families that used the company as a means of social climbing. So here we have a picture of the staircase by Thomas Rawlinson. And the game basically said, if we're going to approach the subject of the East India Company, instead of thinking about Clive and the Nawabs and the grand treaties, let's think about it as a fundamentally a social and cultural drama. Okay, so I can't talk about all of John Company because I've already blown my first 5 minutes and the design is simply too large. What I want to instead focus on is how the game does politics. And I want to show you the difference between the first edition, which had a kind of simplistic political engine, and then the second edition. And I'm not going to get too argumentative here. I'm just going to show you how it works, and hopefully it'll give you a sense of how some of these strategies can be adapted to your own practices. So when it comes to game design, the thing that I'm interested in, after you get that question of who are the players and what do they want, the next question is, what kind of things were those historic actors worried about? So I love reading primary letters. I love reading primary documents such as letters, different kinds of correspondence, because you can get a sense of what the people who were actually in the thick of it, what they were worried about, and then you could try to design a system that will create those same pressures. Okay, so here is the first edition of John Company. So, apologies for the quality of the image. And all the political elements are handled on the right side of the board over here. And mostly the political elements of the game are handled in a single phase using an event deck, a randomized event deck. So every turn, you're going to flip a card from the Whitehall Evening Post, and you're going to resolve all the things on it. And then at the very bottom, there's a law, which players will either pass or not pass. Now, I like cards in my designs, and I like to put special effect text. And the general idea of these laws is if they would pass, they would permanently alter the rules of the game. And that feels very impactful and interesting. But I found this system pretty flat. So the way voting works, for instance, you'll see at the bottom right, there's a little voting track. You can track to see if the proposal is passing or failing. And at the bottom, I treat votes as a combination of assets. So the more economic, the wider your economic base of power is, the more votes you're going to have. And then also just cash. In this era, it was pretty common to just use your wealth to pass a particular piece of legislation. Not that it's uncommon now, of course. But critically, I didn't really think about the British government. I thought about this legislation purely from the perspective of the company, which is why you'll note on the right that that voting begins with the chairman. So the chairman makes a vote, everybody goes around, the vote either passes or fails. Now, this is a really weird and reactionary and backwards way of thinking about laws, because laws in the first issue of John Company come out randomly. You're drawn from a deck and either you vote for it or you don't. But in reality, legislation, it can be quite evil, but it's never capricious. Some people might want to lower taxes and some people might want to raise them. But there are political realities that are tending to what kinds of things make it into legislation and what kind of things don't. So when I went about working on the second edition of John Company, the first thing I wanted to do was to revise the law system. And I had two goals. I wanted the law system to create character for the British government and capture some of the drama of parliamentary politics. And I wanted the law system to act as a toolbox rather than an event deck. So here's the board of the second edition. You can see it's a lot prettier than the first edition. That's mostly because I got better at using Adobe Illustrator. And also because I hired an artist. Now, the only part of parliamentary politics that you see on this board is over here on the right. This is a vote track that gets used. And one thing I wanted to do in this version of the game was emphasize the power and importance of the prime minister. Here we have Pitt the Younger, the giant factotum amusing himself. This is a cartoon by James Gilray. And I wanted one player to have a title and act as prime minister. And critically, they would gain power and prestige from being the prime minister. And if they lost the prime ministership, they would lose it. I mean, and that prime minister position could move around the table depending on how voting went. So the very first thing that I wanted to do was establish some kind of basic parliamentary rules. So I said, okay, this is a parliamentary system. And at this time, if you went to Parliament if you went to the House of Commons with a law that was unpopular and you got badly defeated, you would resign, believe it or not. And there'd probably be an election and they'd change government. It sounds like a utter fantasy saying that today, but that's actually how it was. And so I said, okay, well, here's a very simple structure. The prime minister has to pick a law. They put the law up for a vote. And if the vote fails, they lose their job. And the player who voted the most against the law, they get to become the new prime minister. So the leader of the opposition moves into 10 Downing Street. Now, I liked this because it meant that a prime minister had to build coalitions. They wanted to stay in power. But there was still another problem, which is how do you make it so the laws feel like a choice? Now, remember in the first version of the game, there's a little law deck and the laws are dealt randomly. You get one and you're stuck with it. So maybe there's a huge crisis on the Indian subcontinent and you badly need to build more ships. And the law that you draw is like a tax on sheep. That's not really thematic. It's not really doing any lifting. I couldn't have the law deck be so capricious. So we went with a system that worked like this. I made 25 law cards. And the prime minister, before they go to Parliament, gets to draw a random law card. So here's one that is a trade regulation that removes some graft from the executive managers in India and allows it to be kept in the company's balance. So the shareholders love this. The executive managers hate it. And maybe the prime minister doesn't like the first card they draw. Well, they can draw a second card. And so this law is also a regulation. This one says all the loot the company makes goes to the company balance. So this, again, great for the shareholders. The people who are going to hate this are the military complex within the British East India Company. So the prime minister now has a choice. They could choose either of these two cards, or they could draw a third card. But critically, they might draw a dilemma. So here we have a dilemma before Parliament, relief demanded for Indian famine. When a dilemma is drawn, the other two cards that they were choosing from are discarded immediately, and the prime minister has to deal with the last card. And this is a very, very simple push your luck system. And what it's trying to capture is the degree to which you can control your circumstances or become a victim to them, depending on how much you are trying to become flexible. So the idea here is that in this kind of political atmosphere, I think even in our own political atmosphere, a party always needs to balance flexibility with getting jumped on by circumstance. In this case, being jumped on by a demand for relief to an Indian famine. So in this case, again, 3 cards dealt. When the third one is dealt, they have to pick it because it's a red card. Otherwise, if that card hadn't been drawn, they could choose from any of the ones that they drew. Okay. Now this created another issue, which is I want the laws to be relevant. So maybe you're not a shareholder, you don't have any interest in the company. How's a law going to be relevant to you? Well, throughout the game, players are going to be getting these assets. These are deeds to different kinds of luxuries and enterprises. And the main thing I want you to note about them is some of them have little ballot boxes. Those are vote icons. So they show that you have more votes because of your interest in workshops or shipyards. But all 3 of them in the top right have a little banner tag. This is an enterprise type. The workshop is a manufacturing enterprise. The luxury is a social enterprise. And then the shipyard is a shipping and logistical enterprise. Now, the critical thing is I wanted to design a sub-law system that basically works, and I wish I had this properly illustrated, like two tumblers. One tumbler is different enterprise types, and the other tumbler is the effects laws can have on those enterprises. So I imagined three primary effects. You could be taxed for the things that you have. You could have subsidies for the things that you have, or the things that you have could be increase or decrease in prestige, social standing. So the idea here is that you could pass a law that taxes top hats, or pass a law that taxes shipyards. Maybe you want to give a subsidy to the workshop owners. And these different options are things that the prime minister can potentially put as riders in the law that will enable them to do that coalition building. Now, one small thing, I'll note that on the luxury in the bottom left, there's a window icon. And this is just a small historical anecdote. That window represents what's called a window tax liability. And in this period, it was very difficult before people reported their income in any meaningful way to assess how much someone was worth when it came to taxation. So for almost the same period covered in the game, the long 18th century and early 19th century, if you wanted to see how wealthy someone is, if you were a government assessor trying to tax someone, they would count the windows on people's property. The idea being the more windows you have, the bigger your house, the more you're paying to heat it, the more taxes you owe to the government. Now, you can imagine what this might have caused. If you go to England today and you walk through the streets of Bath, you'll see lots of windows that were bricked up to become tax dodges. But this is just kind of an interesting way. Other countries in Europe in this period had chimney taxes, which worked on pretty much the same logic. Okay, so let's get back to this law display, and I'll kind of roll things up pretty quickly here. So we have these three laws in front of us, and in the bottom you'll see that they have these wedges. These kind of, not wedges really, but these like funny arced shapes, and those are the policy ramifications. Now, each of them has an icon, and so you'll see on the trade regulations, if trade regulations is proposed, the prime minister has to do something with shipyards. And if treasury reform is proposed, the prime minister has to do something with company shares. That little heart symbol represents that's the seal of the East India Company. And then the dilemma, if the poor prime minister gets stuck with that dilemma, they're going to have to tax someone. Now, critically, the law does not tell you who you have to tax, and that is decided by this wheel. All right. I know there's systems and systems, but we're almost to the end here. So this is the prime minister dial, and it's my little nod at old Victorian board games that often had spinners in them and different kind of roll and move mechanisms. And the way this worked is the prime minister is always pointing at one thing. And if a law comes up, he will have to pick a policy. He or she will have to pick a policy that will spin the arm either clockwise or counterclockwise. And it's fun to spin this guy's arm around, of course. Now, how does that work in practice? Well, let's take a look. Let's imagine that the poor prime minister was stuck with this relief demanded for Indian famine card. So they've got to tax someone. So the prime minister is faced with a simple binary choice. You can spin the arm clockwise or counterclockwise, which is to say you can tax the shares or the shipyards. Now, that arm has to stop at the first thing that matches the symbol or policy on the card. And this is very important because I think that when we're doing games about politics and about diplomacy, and if you take away nothing else from my talk, take away this point. Oftentimes, the problem with games that cover politics and diplomacy is that they don't deal with diplomatic or tactical diplomatic inertia. You can't just make any deal. Not every deal is available in all circumstances. So I try to find places where I can boil things down to binary choices or even just a few choices. So in this case, the prime minister has to tax. They have to choose, they have to choose shares. If they go clockwise or if they go counterclockwise, they're taxing shipyards. Now, why do they have to choose those two things? That's just where their hand was. And in future turns, it'll be in different places. Now, one small note, the system is also built to generate interesting coalitions both for the prime minister and for the opposition. So if the opposition wins, if the prime minister is defeated and there's no relief given for the sufferers of the Indian famine, the opposition leader will be able to go to an adjacent policy. So here's how that would look. Let's imagine that the prime minister is going to tax the shareholders. And he's doing that because he thinks the shareholders are weak and he can recruit enough people who aren't shareholders to tax them. Well, the shareholders do not want to be taxed. And so what they can say is, hey, if you vote against taxing for the shareholders, we can pivot this policy either to the right to give the shipyards power, or the left to give the workshops power. And so what this does is every decision creates opportunities for both coalition building and coalition breaking. Okay, so what's the sum of all this? The goal of this game was to make a political system that sharpened the coalitions that naturally emerge in the game. I want to divide players where possible and to try to show them the importance of coalition building within a parliamentary system. And this oftentimes means that the prime minister, who has tremendous power, is in a fundamentally obsequious role. He is trying to present things to the players, desperately attempting to hold on to power. Okay, so that's it. I'm happy to take questions about how that system works. There's obviously a lot of details I skipped over, but I hope that gives you some ideas if you are covering any kind of political or legal framework within your games. Thanks.
All right, folks. Thank you, Cole. We're going to kind of stack up questions, and we're going to get to them with the whole group together as we go through this. So we want to give everybody their chance to sort of get their little infomercial out there quickly. So next up, Amabel from Hollandspiel is here, and we're going to let her take over and take the show from here, and I will get the slides up on screen.
Okay. So, Ash, go ahead and skip to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that games make historical arguments and model things. And one of the things the games can do very well is they can create empathy via identification and immersion. They give you a role so you're playing a particular historical actor. You have historical goals. You have historical tools. You are walking a mile in their shoes, and that can be very useful with engaging with the past. Games also can have a lot of texture, often through event decks and the like, where you have the different people, places, and things. That creates a lot of curiosity about the topic, and you might want to look into it further. But there's another way to approach it that I find very interesting. I think is very specific to games and board games particularly, and that's using them to model structural issues, systemic factors that create political, social conflicts. Go ahead and go to the next slide there, Brant. And that's because games themselves are systems. And with board games in particular, in order to play a board game, in order to engage with the system, you have to understand the rules. You have to have a full picture of the thing in order to manipulate it. Unlike with a video game where you kind of can, the game has a lot of black box stuff that hides it from you. But with a board game, you need to understand the whole thing to some degree in order to work it. And because of that, it makes it a very good format for looking at a system, at a structural thing. Games also literalize. They make abstract things concrete. So they take things that are kind of fuzzy and ineffable, and they narrow them down to pieces of cardboard and wood and cards that have specific properties dictated by fixed rules. And that can be considered a liability of the form for some people, but I think it's actually like a strength, because if it helps us see systemically. And if we use to model real world systems, particularly systems of oppression, it can help us to better understand them and our role in them. And why we want to do that? Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. Why it matters. So human beings, I think, we're built for stories and anecdotes, for immersion, identification, texture. That's how our brain works. We have a lot harder time thinking about the way society is structured. We can understand that a given action is harmful, that it is racist, sexist, ableist, homophobic, transphobic. That's one I'm familiar with. And it's harder to see that the assumptions upon which our society, the structure, the system is built, the people is built for, and built not for, can be harmful. And our actions and choices within that system can make us complicit in that harm. And so games, I think, uniquely can model conflicts within these kind of systems, help us understand it, and then question our role and our complicity. And I've done a couple games that try to do that. So next slide. first of those is This Guilty Land. This is a game about the political struggle over slavery in antebellum America. Go ahead, go to the next slide there. And this models that political debate, that conflict, in a 2-player game with 3 factions. Those factions are justice and oppression, and a non-player faction, compromise. Now, compromise is really the core of the argument the game is trying to make. Compromise is the people in the middle who just want the 2 sides to stop arguing and be civil and try to compromise and find a way to, not cause a fuss. And they value that over, meaningful change. And I wanted the players to derive meaning from that, from the interaction of the 2-player factions with compromise, rather than from playing, I'm not learning something playing justice particularly or playing oppression particularly, because I don't really want to create empathy, for example, for oppression. That's not something where I think is useful. But if I can center the observation of this model, the way these 3 interact, and create space for people to ask questions about that, I thought that'd be very useful. So I tried to use a board game version of Bruck's alienation effect, where I'm giving distance between the players and the game. One of the ways I do that is by being very didactic. So you are this abstract concept of justice or oppression, instead of localizing it within, a person or group of people. I tried to make it less immersive. So instead of having a lot of texture with the events, they're pretty fungible within a certain, we have cards for, people and different things, but they kind of all act the same. And that's to kind of push you further away from the game, so you have a space to observe and think and to ask, just to get frustrated with how compromise is preventing things from getting done, and then to ask, what am I doing right now in to deal with things going on today? Am I doing enough? Is it safe for me to say something? And how does that impact things? And those are questions that don't really have answers, but they're useful to ask. And that's really the purpose of the game, was to find a way to create a space for someone to grapple with those questions, and to use this historical conflict to also think about today's conflicts and today's issues. Go to the next slide. And I did a second game that uses a lot of the same mechanisms, called The Vote, Suffrage, and Suppression in America. Go to the next slide. And this is modeling the fight for women's suffrage in the United States, culminating in the passing of the 19th Amendment. Now, there are 3 factions here. The non-player faction is apathy, and then we have equality and supremacy. And I chose the name supremacy very carefully, because this isn't only a game about women's suffrage, but it's also about the building of Jim Crow laws in the South. And it's about linking, the kind of patriarchal opposition to women's voting rights with white supremacy, with this system and the way it's built in American society. So we have 2 things going on in the game. And the thing is, they don't equally intersect. The struggle for women's voting rights, equality is, for it, and supremacy is against it. The issue of Black voting rights and the oppression of Black people in the South, supremacy is working towards that, but equality is not really doing anything about it. And that's a very deliberate choice, because the women's suffrage movement, it achieved its goals by abandoning non-white people, and coming from a movement that came out of the abolitionist movement. That's appalling. And so I tried to use that kind of parallel structure to get people thinking about it, mechanically experiencing this disconnect, and using that to try to make an argument that would stress the need for intersectionality, particularly intersexual feminism. And I think you can use that kind of distance from the game, rather than immersing the player, to get them to think about these systemic factors and these structural issues. And I'm very proud of the work that I've done there. However, I do have doubts about it at the same time. Go to the next slide. Thank you. And that is, how useful is this really in terms of how accessible is it to a wide variety of people? How approachable is it? Because complex systems, even when you model them simply, it still results in complex games. And the games that I do, they are pitched at a certain segment of the hobby market and assume some baseline familiarity with how those games work. If you have someone who's not into war games or political struggle games, coming to this from, say, even just a Euro game hobby area, or someone who's, a non-gamer, the games are going to be indecipherable. And this, because it's so hard because you have to understand the game, the system, in order to engage with the argument, in order to see the system, which is the point of the thing. When you have that kind of cognitive load of trying to learn the thing, it's an obstacle. It's also an obstacle in terms of being a commercial product that's fairly expensive. These kind of games don't necessarily have a broad appeal. And in order to get them out into the world, we use a print-on-demand model. And so the games are much more expensive. And so you have expensive games that are difficult to learn. And I don't know how good those can actually be at reaching the people who, I would like it to reach. And so for me, the Holy Grail is a game that's going to model these kind of systems in a useful way, people thinking about these systems, engaging with them in a useful way, but it's still broadly accessible and approachable to people who aren't, core gamers or aren't already interested in it. I don't want to just preach to the converted. And I don't know how to do that. I haven't gotten there yet. I've had other things going on in the last couple of years. I've kind of lived by the wayside. But I think it's a very interesting direction that games can go. And it can be very useful for games when modeling political conflicts and social conflicts, to look at them systemically. And that is, so in conclusion, the next slide. I'm really bad at conclusions. So here's a picture of my cat monster. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Amabel. Appreciate that. We're going to let Kevin jump in here. He's going to talk some about one of his designs, and I imagine he's going to have a few comments about the other two designs, because he warned us before the presentation that was kind of something he was looking forward to doing anyway. So for folks that are asking some questions, we got a few of them stacking up in Discord. Those of you that are able to put them straight into YouTube, go ahead and do that. Once Kevin's done, we're going to start throwing questions up there. Some people have been putting them into Discord, and so we'll start cutting and pasting those over here also for people to be able to look at as well. So, Kevin, the floor is yours. Hey, Kevin, your audio's dead, man. Are you double muted?
How about now?
There you
go. I was about to say, have you tried turning it off and on?
All right, so everyone can still hear me? Okay, sorry about that, everybody. So my name is Kevin. Let's just start right over. My name is Kevin Bertram. I'm the owner of Fort Circle Games. We are based in Washington, D.C., and we wanted a name of the company that resonated with where the company is based. And so during the Civil War, there were a series of forts that protected the capital from the Confederacy. And those forts, Fort Totten, Fort DuPont, Fort Stevens, they were collectively known as the Fort Circle. And they're now a national park here in DC. So if you ever get out here and you want to see some great hidden treasures, all those forts are pretty fantastic. So actually, I'm actually going to just give a brief highlight of a couple games that we've either done or working on, and how they interact with both what Cole and Amabel said. we're best known for our only game that's actually been published, and that's The Shores of Tripoli. And it's a light introductory war game, and it was designed specifically to be a light introductory war game where it can play in 45 minutes, where it's easy to teach at all levels for people who might not be gamers but have some interest in history, or to students. And I think that it's been a useful tool for thinking of this conference Connections to bring different groups together. So we're running an online tournament right now, and we have teams from CSIS and CNA and IDA and the Ministry of Defense out of the UK and the State Department and the Naval War College, and like all these different groups. But then we're also playing against colleges like VMI and Naval Academy and Georgetown, and then we have some high school teams and game stores. So it's kind of a not unlike what I think Connections tries to do, is bring different perspectives together. I think when you have very simple games, and I think Root, although a more difficult game, but Root also does this in that almost everybody from those same groups I talked about can play Root, and it's a way to have people from different perspectives interact in a game setting, which I think is pretty valuable. Touching on so our next game is called Votes for Women, and it's obviously, I don't want to call it a companion game, but it's obviously covering very similar territory that the Vote does, that Amabel did. And I'm really pleased with this game because I think we tackled some difficult problems. One is that movements aren't uniform movements. And so, you know, the suffrage movement was initially almost synonymous with the abolition movement, but then as particularly the 15th Amendment started driving a wedge, where because the 15th Amendment was only making certain guarantees for votes, that women were excluded from the 15th Amendment, that started causing a schism. And then you continue to see movements coming in and out supporting women's suffrage, whether that's the temperance movement, whether that's labor movement, whether it's, I'd be hard pressed to call it explicitly a feminist movement, but at least there's a semblance of that occurring. And so how do you recognize that even though one player is playing all of these, all of these people who are all these parts of the social movement? And so we try to find ways in the game, and I wish it had been released, it'll be released in June, of how those coalitions can crack while you're working towards a common goal. I think that's fairly applicable in a more specific wargaming perspective of different services have different perspectives. Obviously, the State Department or USAID is going to have very different thoughts than the DoD. And then we start expanding out to what do the members of NATO? They're obviously not uniform. And so how do you model that interaction between all of these different groups who ostensibly are on the same side? We have two more games that I just want to briefly talk about. One is the Halls of Montezuma. And let me take a step back. Votes for Women is designed by Tori Brown, and I'm the developer for that game. Halls of Montezuma is on the Mexican-American War, and I'm a co-designer with that, my friend Gilberto Lopez. And what we've done is we've taken the base system in Shores of Tripoli, which is a pretty simple war game, and we've layered a political aspect on that. So as the American player, you're not really the American player, you're the Polk administration. And you have to both pass your legislation that you need. Sometimes it's funding the war, sometimes it's passing treaties with Britain or New Grenada. And that's also, or things that make you more popular, while at the same time prosecuting this war, where as the more effort you put on that, the more successful the war is, the more popularity you have. But as you meet, whether it's defeats or at least slowdowns, then the war, lose popularity to pass your domestic issues. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic. I'm sure I'm trying to think of other games that have done that. To be honest, I'm not really sure if it's been done like this. We'll see if it's well received. And then I think the game that I'm most excited about, but won't come out till 2023, is called Guano, Guano, Guano. And everyone's kind of like, what's that about? And so I think people miss is that guano was guano is bird shit and bat shit. And it was fundamentally important as fertilizer from about 1850 to 1900 in the United States. And we would not have been able to feed our population if we hadn't developed all these sources of guano. unfortunately, the way we developed all these sources of guano was this massive act of imperialism, where the Guano Islands Act allowed any American to just grab a land that wasn't owned by another country and claim it, or European country, and claim it for theirs. And so that's why we have all these far-flung little islands in the South Pacific and to a lesser extent in the Caribbean. But the lines that run through that game are pretty impressive, or through what happened historically. There's this labor movement that's occurring and labor abuses. There is environmental degradation that is occurring, while you have these CEOs, which is what the players are playing, just trying to get literal shit to market that they could turn into Gilded Age baubles. So I like all of I think the theme in all of our games, though, is that they're a mixture of war and not war, and how they can interact, because I know Jason Matthews gave a presentation a little earlier on the political, or the Paul Mill divide, and I think that's sort of something that hinders wargaming, particularly professional wargaming, is that things are siloed off. You're only looking at the military side, and you have to have security clearances, so you're not including what people are doing in the commercial space, even though what's happening in the commercial space, for example, satellites or whatever you're modeling in your war game, I think that it's kind of narrowing and siloing, and that shouldn't be occurring. I'm not sure how much longer you guys all want me to speak, but I was going to say there are a couple key things I think that come out of hobby wargaming, though, that are helpful for professional wargaming, and that's, I think that, for lack of a better term, dice are good, and that kind of random element that reflects individual agency that you as a player can control. So the individual agency of your troops, or of whatever's being modeled. And I think probably the best example of I think where wargaming failed was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think that anyone who took a systems analysis look at it before it happened would immediately say, oh, well, Russia's going to walk all over them. I certainly thought that would have happened. And I think that was wrong, because I think we missed both the individual agency of Russian troops and their commanders not being particularly motivated, whereas the high motivations in Ukraine. And I think we just need to, I guess, do a little better job of accounting of what's happening at that individual level. And that's hard to model in a game, but I think randomness is one of the ways we can do that. I'm also certainly encourage the professional wargaming community to steal liberally. So, I mean, Shores of Tripoli draws on hundreds of designs of card-driven games. Votes for Women owes a lot to 1960. Root, that Cole Design certainly owes a bit to the coin system. Like, everything is always building on something that's been built before, and I think it would be a really good idea for the professional wargaming community to steal as much as they can from the whatever we're called the hobby or commercial wargaming side of things. So that's sort of the main overview. I think I've probably filled up my 10 or 15 minutes, and I'd rather, I think, spend more time on questions, and especially, I'm pretty intrigued about what Amabel and Cole have to say, and so I'm sure people have some great questions for them.
Yeah, we've already had a handful of questions stacking up in the chat, so I think we're going to start throwing some of these in here. And so I know there was one that this one, that's actually not the one we were after there. We're going to pull this one over from Discord that Edward had asked, because I think this directly ties in, especially with what Amabel was saying, but I think all three of you have some points here. So Amabel, I don't know if you want to take this one first. To what extent do you think that a game designer can or should ensure that players can reach conclusions different to their own? So as an example, make it clear about how sort of those other models and systems, and systems exist. So Amabel, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll sort of throw it to wherever.
It's certainly important to leave room for argument and disagreement within a design. And that's, I think, one thing that I try to do in the designs I talked about was more raise questions than give answers, and to give people space to argue with it. if they want to. And I do think that's important because it is important for any thing you put out there to have enough space to question its assumptions and to engage with it rather than just telling you that's what it means. I was talking with a friend yesterday about metaphors in literature, and how the best metaphors are the ones that can mean multiple things and you can't quite pin down what it means. Whereas, if it's the green light at the end of the pier represents X, it's blah. So I feel that you definitely need to have some space for someone to argue. And the games are good at modeling tensions, and if there's fissures within a game's argument, tensions within a game's argument, that can be very compelling. That's my answer.
Yeah. Cole, what do you think? You're still on mute.
I'll fix that first. I completely agree. I mean, I think sometimes I create a little bit of a distinction between what gets called message games from games with arguments, and the message game being like, I can't remember her last name at the moment, but the game Train. And there's a whole class of games like this that really are trying to deliver one point. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And there are many points that are so important that you don't really want a lot of room for interpretation. But in terms of the sort of work that I find myself doing, and I think many of the folks on this call do, is try to present the system in a way that it can be read a couple different ways. So, there were two questions while I was working on John Company. There were two questions that came up. One towards the very beginning of development, someone asked me, how likely is it that the historical event happens? And I thought, well, I don't know, maybe 15%, 20%. That seems reasonable. I mean, how likely is it that anything happened? It seems astronomically low. But at the same time, everything that did happen needs to be able to happen for that system to have a kind of argumentative strength and cohesion. And then the other question was given to me by a tester at the very end, which is, I just finished this big project. John Company I didn't really say this, but is explicitly anti-colonial. Almost all of its theoretical framework is from post-colonial scholarship. But it isn't simple. I don't do a lot of work in caricature when it comes to the game's argumentation. And I really try to make the game be a lot more about the banality of evil and the ways in which a lot of everyday decisions can create quite insidious frameworks, and about complicity itself. And that means that the game can be misread. And so I had a playtester right at the very end ask me this question and said, if Boris Johnson or Niall Ferguson were to play John Company, would they get it? Niall Ferguson is a reactionary pro-imperial historian, and everybody probably knows who Boris Johnson is. And I thought about this question because I thought, okay, somebody who goes into John Company without engaging the arguments, is the game going to sway them? And I thought, well, I don't know. And where my own personal feeling about this is, I think I have to, part of the liability, the moral hazard of designing games is that some people are going to read or play a game that you work on and take away the wrong lesson. And that ultimately is just going to say a lot more about them than about you. But I also think that one of my favorite elements about working in this forum is how lossy it is. I do not even understand all the arguments that the game makes. I mean, that's for other people to kind of sort through. And ultimately, every project that we work on is a product of the cultural context that creates it, which means it contains all the good and the bad, background that informs who we are, and which means it can't help but say a lot of things about the context of its creation. So, I mean, to that question directly, I really want, my main goal is for players to understand, as Annabelle put it, those tensions, and to feel those tensions and to understand the kinds of pressure that different historical actors were under. And it's a way of bringing the past closer and making it a little bit less inscrutable. And that is going to reveal things that are unsettling because, a lot of evil is done by humans who are just as human as you or I. and depriving them of their humanity is a convenient thing if you want to make an easy political point. But it's sort of like it makes difficult subjects easy, and that's not always fair to the historical record either.
Yeah, in our designs, at least the ones that I'm more involved in, we certainly aim for a subtlety. And so in Shores of Tripoli, there's actually a slight bias for the Tripolitan side. And when you first start playing it, it's actually even more pronounced. And that was deliberate because it should be hard to send a bunch of wooden ships across an ocean and make war on another people. And I think that's true in 1801 or 1901 or 2001. And I don't think that I actually even realized I was doing that when I was working on the design. Now, some of our designs are more straightforward. In Votes for Women, there's literally a card where you can embrace white supremacy as the women's movement, and you get a bunch of benefits. It's one of the most powerful cards, but then there's inevitable consequences for doing so. And so, I think that our biggest concern is that people will want to play the bad guys. We've shelved a design that we're working on that was called Mass Incarceration, and it's the rise of the prison population, particularly at the federal level, and like what Supreme Court decisions and what laws were passed and where public opinion is and how it affected that. And, when we were looking at it, like the worst feeling is that, yeah, cops are going to buy this game and get the very wrong message that, yes, let's put as many people in prison, particularly focusing on minorities. And just like, so you have to sort of be careful that your game isn't too subtle in its argument. But yeah, I think we certainly err on the side of at least a little bit of subtlety in the argument. So, or at least personally, I do.
I want to follow up a thought Cole made a minute ago, because it's been a pet peeve of mine. And I know there's some people in the audience that'll probably recognize where I'm about to go with this, but it's something that I've seen in a bunch of the historical games, and Kevin, Shores of Tripoli is one of them. And I think you and I even had an email exchange about this at one point. I definitely have seen it in things like Liberty or Death or A Distant Plain, some of the different coin games. Cole, you mentioned the idea that somebody had said, what are the likelihood of this specific historical event happening, and sort of having those different historical events on the cards throughout the game that may come into play, or certain actions happening a certain way, whether it's in John Company or any of the other historical based games. One of the things that I've always been curious about in some of those game designs is a lot of them have all of the historical events that did happen. And there may be some specific rules, like Twilight Struggle bounds them to certain time ranges, but not necessarily a sequence, as a for instance. But one of the things that we seem to very seldom see in some of those backward looking games are events that could have happened and were plausible and had all of the appropriate conditions present to have happened, but still did not. And those could have happened, but actually didn't, seem to very rarely make it into a game. And Amabel, I know you and I had discussed on a podcast once the submission that you got on the Napoleonic Wars, where all of these certain events had to happen within certain frameworks, within very complex decks of cards, that was basically sort of just flipping over cards in the order that the wars happened for 10 years. But that, again, was all events that actually happened, not necessarily ones that could have but didn't for whatever reason within history. Just real quickly, Cole, you got any thoughts on that? And if Kevin or Amabel want to jump in after that, I'm kind of curious how, if at all, you consider working those into games, or just go ahead and discard them. No pun intended.
Yeah, so
it didn't work.
I have a kind of a short answer on this, which I think we'll get right to the point. So I've started thinking about. Okay, so I ran into this problem when I was working on John Company, which is on the legal side, which is the laws that were passed. The East India laws were huge omnibus laws. They weren't changing one rule of the game; they were changing 30 rules of the game. And there'd be a big omnibus, and then 30 years would pass, and people would get mad, and there'd be another big omnibus, and that was how things went for more than 100 years. Now that's horrible from a game perspective. The game is just very maladapted to do it. So what I ended up doing was. Like as if breaking peanut brittle, I sort of broke those laws up, found interesting little parts, adapted to the game system, and then said, okay, here's the law deck. None of these laws, or almost none of the laws, with a couple exceptions, are historical laws. they are all just elements of other historic laws. And so I'm participating in like a little bit of historic trickery to try to replicate the right tension. And I've started thinking about the practice of doing some of these historical games like historical fiction. And I think that, you know, you might look at Lukash's The Historical Novel and other theoretical works on historical fiction, because I think they provide a really good framework for choosing what elements to bring out for dealing with a history. You know, when Scott was writing the Waverley novels, these are all novels that are trying to capture a certain kind of mid-18th century spirit, but oftentimes they had very limited relationship with the actual truth. And I think, you know, when you're working in historical fiction, you can still say a lot of important things, but you have to kind of mute them. And the very last note, because I think that this ties into a point that I saw Rex bring up in the chat that I'm sure we'll get to, and I want to let Amabel in here in just a second. But one thing that I think a lot about on this subject is framing and being really clear to the audience where a game is taking liberties, where possible, and also knowing what your goal is, right? There's a big difference, for instance, between reading something like Robert Caro's The Power Broker as your own and musing on the nature of political power, or studying it before you enter a civil service job and taking all the wrong lessons, right? And so I think that that's a place where the educational framework and like good pedagogy and the practice of debriefs and things can help like really bring a work to life. But you almost always need that kind of pedagogic frame if you're going to really try to use these for like lessons in a classroom setting.
Yeah. Amabel, you wanted to jump in here.
Yeah, so actually I have something to say about both of those points. And the first is about, you know, what could happen, what's likely to happen. I just wanted to say that, yeah, history happens their way, but a lot of it is chance and coincidence. And like one of my favorite stories that I can't remember all the details of right now is how John Andre was captured with the plans for West Point, you know, because Benedict Arnold was going to, you know, give it to the British. And he was captured because he took the wrong road and he went the long way. And there was someone who happened to have a coat that he thought was a British coat, but it was an American, and that's how they captured him. And if that hadn't happened, chances are they would have taken West Point. And who knows how the American Revolutionary War would have played out at that point. Like it and that and how all of history since then would play out. And it all turns on these tiny little things. And so often when people are looking at historical games, especially commercial games, you know, they're very much looking at like, well, how accurate is this? But it's actual history is so improbable that it really does need to be modeled in some way, and it's a challenge.
Yeah.
And the other thing I wanted to say about framing is that you know, the games I've done, they're not particularly subtle as far as is basic principles. Like this Guilty Land, right from the start, I very clearly say, you know what, slavery was bad. I shouldn't have to say this, but I'm going to say it because I did not want to be misinterpreted. That was very important to me. And partially that was important to me because, you know, I'm releasing a board game, and if the wrong people get the wrong idea about it and control that narrative of what that game is or is not, you know, it would not be a particularly pleasant experience for myself. So I try to be very clear about what that argument is. You know, that basic baseline thing. While still leaving room for subtlety within the actual argument about compromise and civility and moderation. And I think, you know, I think when you're dealing with a tricky subject, you absolutely need to say, hey, this is where we're starting from.
Yeah.
And bad things are bad, you know. And I think that And that's why I'm not very subtle.
Well, this is something I think a lot about from the practice of like teaching rhetoric, right? And it's one reason why I find myself writing a lot about my designs. I'm doing that because I like to share the process, and I like the process of writing about design. I'm also doing it because I need to make an ethos claim and make it very clear to the audience what the game is doing, why it's doing that, because we live in an era where it's just very easily to misread. It's very easy to misread everything. And so I'm trying to do my best to just make sure that the message gets across as cleanly as possible while still like kind of opening up room. And I think that's just adapting to the state of the discourse. Well, I just want to say one small thing about something that Annabelle brought up that also reminded me of the Shores of Tripoli, which is about risk and probability in game design. There is a trend in hobby games towards a little bit of, let's call it like input randomness, but ultimately a lot of risk mitigation, that if you don't want to roll the dice, spend more resources, you don't have to roll the dice. And that has been a trend in the hobby game world for 20 years or more, right? There's just a lot of ways to kind of control. And when you look at something like the war in Ukraine, you see the pitfall of any probabilistic system that has a really hard ledge where something becomes a certainty. And so what one design principle that I like to take into a lot of my work is building my probabilistic systems around S-curves, where you can spend resources to really dramatically increase your chances. But at a certain point, you see those diminishing returns. And you can keep spending, you can keep throwing money at it, and you might go from 97% chance of success to 98, and then maybe to 98.5. So the way, and this can be quite simple when it comes to an actual mechanism. How John Company works is you spend resources to roll dice, and you just take the best result. And so, you know, at the beginning, if you're rolling 3 dice and taking the best result, well, adding a 4th dice is a great deal. But once you get to 8 or 9 dice, adding that 8th or 9th dice is hardly changing your odds. However, and this is the critical thing, and one of the things I love about Shores of Tripoli too, it's possible that everything will fail. And I have had so many images that people send me on social media of like, oh, I played John Company and we rolled 12 failures or something. And I always think like, well, that's critical because that can happen. And it's really important to, I think, design a framework if you're trying to model places where there's uncertainty that preserves the uncertainty in almost every circumstance, because someone is going to misidentify a coat and it's going to turn the war in one direction or another.
That's me in any Napoleonic war game. I'm rolling 14 dice and get 1 hit. My opponent's rolling 3 and gets 3. And that's happened more than once. And we have the proof on YouTube. It's pretty deflating when it happens to you. Let's get Kevin, if you have anything to add to this quickly, and then Amabel, if you got anything to add to this quickly. We've got a bunch of other questions stacking up. I want to make sure we get
all I was going to say is, with our historical games, we try to hew closely to the events that occurred, but we also have to recognize that there need to be some paths for the player. Otherwise, you're just reading a book. And so in Tripoli, historically the game ended the war ended with a peace treaty, but we give the player an option, the American player, to actually try to capture Tripoli. But I'm not really a big fan of introducing these kind of counterfactuals or what ifs, except to the fact that when we clearly make it clear in our rule book, so like, hey, this did not happen, but it could happen, because a lot of our games, we are thinking that they'll be good for classroom use. But yeah, so it's you have to walk a balance between that. How far do I stray from education and make it more of a fun game without losing, its historical accuracy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, all right, I think we're ready to move on to some next questions here. And so we've got one. Where to go? I got to scroll back up to find this thing. So without engaging in the 14th jihad of doctrinal terminology, the idea of, so Zoe, I'm going to jump in here briefly. Not all of these necessarily would be considered war games. And that's a little bit the point of what we wanted to bring this panel together to do. All of these guys have designed war games. Amabel's done a bunch of pretty much straight up war games with some of the swords and shields and some of these older, very kinetic, stabby, pointy, shooty kinds of games. But part of what we wanted to bring this panel together specifically to do is that wargaming in the big tent sense of sort of opposed decision making with actual adjudication and competitive results that are needed in the professional space for analytical or training purposes or whatever other professional purposes we're looking at. There are a lot of mechanics that are necessary in games like that don't involve just blowing stuff up. And that's part of the reason we wanted to bring this panel together. So some of these games I think are explicitly not war games. We didn't talk a bunch about Nicaea, but that is very much not a war game. I don't think many people would consider John Company to be a war game. The Votes for Women. These are not explicit war games. But that was sort of the point of this panel, is that they still have mechanics that would be useful to those designers that may want to pillage them for larger strategic purposes in other games that do include more of a wargaming component to them. With that, I'll get off the soapbox. Kevin, any thoughts there? And we'll just, if anybody else wants to jump in before I start throwing other questions up here.
Well, I was wondering which one of us was going to say it first, but Uncle Carl, the famous said, politics is just, or war is politics by other means, and I think that they blend together. I've been told that Shores of Tripoli is not a war game, and maybe I don't really care how we determine things. But then, similarly, Votes for Women, as Tori noted, in that struggle, there were battles and there were casualties and there were wins and there were losses, and it was a war to pass the 19th Amendment. Whether that's technically a war game, I just don't even care anymore about the distinctions. I think that we need to realize that we should not be making that divide between political and military, and really think about how they work together, as well as with commercial and all of the other aspects that face us in the modern world. And certainly the professional war gamers should be thinking from a broader scope.
Yeah.
I think that categories are useful when they highlight affinities, and they're less useful when they exclude. And so I would even use wargame, to describe these games, because it highlights certain affinities with traditional wargaming. And so for me, that broad categorization works very well. Certainly, games like The Guilty Land or The Vote are more like war games than they are like a Euro game, for example, or a mass market hobby game. Yeah. So I'm definitely in agreement there.
Yeah, I think questions of genre are I leave them to the marketing teams, right? They're like oftentimes I remember sometimes, thankfully this doesn't happen anymore, but I would get these questions about like, oh, is game design art? Does this count as art? And I'm like, I don't know. That's a word that some people you use to defend the things you think are valuable and devalue the things you think that aren't, right? I don't know, but I do think that there is the way war game gets used as a verb to war game something, I think to me suggests a different design philosophy. And when it comes to any design I'm working on, I do find myself where I'm like, okay, I need to kind of like, what is the war game as a verb design practice for trying to build a system that's going to really capture those tensions, as opposed to derive meaning from itself. So I do think that there are these kind of like two fundamentally different ways of thinking about design practices. And a lot of hobby design, if I'm designing a party game or something, there's nothing wrong with party games. Oftentimes I'm trying to make those systems have value within the space of the party game. So they're deriving their meaning from the context of the game themselves. But when I'm starting on a historical project, I want to adapt and capture the tensions of the topic I'm covering. And that to me has me drawing from the wargaming toolbox, and what it ends up getting called on the shelf, who cares, right? But I think we're all in agreement on that.
Your idea of using wargame as a verb to wargame your way through something, one of the things that has started to appear more, and I've seen it a lot on social media, but I've also seen it in some other non-military contexts, because the military folks all understand that if I've got to wargame my way through a problem, they know exactly what you mean. But in a business context or an academic context, the term that I've seen a lot of people using is red teaming, right? They want to go red team a problem where they're providing intentional opposition to force people to clarify and refine the problem and the process that they're working their way through. Again, like you, I think there are times in which the terms are useful and meaningful. And look, we got a 90-minute podcast out of What is a War Game one time. So it was great because that was, it allowed us to fill an entire, podcast episode. So that was awesome. but I do think that there are times where you're right. Like, let the marketing guys figure it out. I just want to design a cool game, and that's totally fine. I have one here that was specifically addressed to Amabel, block by block. Probably the closest I've seen to fulfilling your holy grail of being politically didactic and relatively popular. Any thoughts on it? As a note, this person hasn't played it at all. Don't know if you have. I have it. I've not played it. I've read through it. But it's an urban insurgency with some political meaning behind it, but a lot of it is sort of the actual execution of the kind of urban insurgent warfare there, but not in a very like dicey CRT, stabby shooty kind of way. So, but if you've not played it, then I guess this question's not helping us.
I've read about it a little bit, but I haven't had a chance to play it yet. No.
Yeah. All right. So Tracy's weighing in here. Art versus science depends on your institution. And I've seen this with a social science background. I've seen BA degrees and BS degrees, both in communication. So I've seen that from both perspectives. One of the things for connections, the connections movement as a whole is very much designed to preserve and expand and promote the art and science and application of wargaming. So we certainly recognize this as both an art and a science. If anybody's got any thoughts on that tension, that dichotomy, please jump in here, and I'll go looking for another good question to throw up here.
I actually just want to say that I think Root actually comes pretty close to being that holy grail game, because that is a game that is, has widespread popularity. It's an excellent game, and yet it also has something that is saying if you're paying attention. And so, I'm actually very mad that Cole designed that game, because I wanted to make a game. So there's a North Korean cartoon called Squirrel and Hedgehog, and the squirrels are the leaders and the hedgehogs are the soldiers, and then the ducks are their Navy and Air Force, and they're fighting against, and they're defending Flower Hill, which is North Korea, and they're fighting against the mice, which are the South Koreans, and the weasels, who are Japanese. That's the first season. And then in the second season, the wolves, who is the United States, comes in, and then there's this kind of sexy fox spy that I haven't quite figured out yet, but I guess even in North Korea there are furries, I guess. And so I'm like, this would be a great game. I wanted to really make that game, and then Root came out, and I'm like, well, I can't make that game because everyone will say I'm just copying Root. So I got to
figure out how you got access to North Korean television, Kevin. So I think that this question about the broadly accessible game, that like it's a holy grail because it has to do an impossible thing, which is make specific arguments without the complexity that specificity would otherwise demand, right? And so like Root, and I think this is a place where I always think about address and audience size. Root at this point is sold about 250,000 copies. We don't know how far it is in its life. It could have a lot more to go. It could be towards like the middle or towards the end. Who knows? That's a huge audience. That's gigantic. But Wingspan has sold over 1 million. So we know that there's more. But also 1 million is not a big number. I mean, it's a big number in the hobby space. But if you have like an idea you're trying to communicate, you're operating at the level of like a C tier Stephen King knockoff author direct to Amazon, right? And that's not bad, but it's just something that I always think about here. And the game that comes to my mind, and I haven't played block by block, but I've looked a lot of, I've watched plays of it, read a lot about it, and I'm interested in it. But Root is, even as broadly adopted as it's been, fundamentally a pretty complicated game. It's got a 3,000 word rule book, which means it kind of puts it in that, it's higher than a Command and Colors, but it's slower than a coin. And so one of the games I think about is something like Secret Hitler, which is a game I have a lot of weird feelings about. But I think if I can pull my feelings out of Secret Hitler for a moment and say, okay, here was a group that wanted to make an anti-fascist game, and they also wanted it to be broadly adaptable. They wanted it to teach lessons about fascism, but for a very, very wide audience. The game is very explicit about this. The first edition, at least the one that I got many years ago, had a comic in it that was a comic about the rise of fascism. It was a very good comic. But people, when you watch people play Secret Hitler, they don't seem to really be playing it to take any kind of lessons about fascism. And so to me, I always think about Secret Hitler as this like cautionary tale that lurks behind everything, because I think about it as a game that maybe had its heart in the right place, but also misfired. And it just points to the difficulty of doing really good discursive work at such a broad cast, right? And so the general strategy that at least I've had is I don't know much about the mass market audience. I just don't. But I know about the mainstream hobby market, and I know about certain corners of the historical game market. And there are huge problems in both of those markets. So I think about them as like classrooms, right? Like, you know, the mainstream hobby market, it's a big classroom full of people who have totally backwards ideas about empire. And sometimes they're overcorrecting one way and sometimes they're overcorrecting another way. But I'm just going to try to like address them. And in the history market, I think like, okay, well, games about, about 19th century geopolitics, there aren't a lot of them. And so I just kind of want to walk into the classroom and fix that one classroom. But the like bigger question of the like true cross demographic hit that is broadly accessible and also has argumentation, I think it can probably be done. I don't know what it's going to be, but I do think that there's a lot of moral hazard in that pursuit too. And I think it's when I hear you talk about it, Amabel, I can hear a reluctance, which to me reads, I don't want to be overreading you, to me reads like you truly understand the hazard of doing it wrong, right? And that's enough to give anybody pause.
Yes, absolutely. It's something that I think about a lot with my work, and I grapple with that a lot and have a lot of doubts about it, which that's not always a fun time. But I think it's doable, but I don't think it's doable now. Because I think, in a way, games that make arguments that are serious, that's still pretty new. I mean, games have been around for a long time, but, when people were playing backgammon thousands of years ago, that they weren't making social political arguments with it, right? So I feel like we can get there. I don't know if it's going to be in my lifetime, which is depressing.
Don't sell yourself short. We don't want you gone that soon. So,
oh no, I'm sticking around for a long time.
Okay, good.
I just figured things out.
Yeah, there's a bunch of different discussion going on in the chat with regards to sort of terminology and kind of where do you draw certain lines around terms and ideas. And again, I pasted the link to the What is a War Game podcast episode in the chat, so folks can go listen to that. I think, again, the terminology and the language can be useful up to a point, but I think so long as we're using it to be inclusive versus exclusive, I think it serves a better purpose. That said, again, don't get overly wrapped around the axle of the terminology specific for this panel, because, again, part of the idea is that we've got a lot of really good ideas that are useful in the professional wargaming space that can be brought in from outside of any sort of wargaming space. And that's part of what we're trying to accomplish with this specific panel. So I for those of you continuing that conversation, like, have at it. We're just not going to throw a ton of it up on screen at the moment. What I do want to do is I want to get back to Rex's comment that I threw up on the screen a little earlier while we were talking about sort of the messages and lessons that the games can put out there. And so Rex had to type this across 3 different YouTube comments just because there's a character limit for what we've got with YouTube. Really interesting discussion. In serious game design, the wrong lesson can have real life consequences up to and including people dying, especially with the kinds of serious games for potential national security purposes that we're talking about having appeal to our audience and much of our audience, whether currently present or watching this after the fact, generates a practical and moral obligation to identify and mitigate negative learning, as Rex says, or as he wraps up here, or to make sure you can identify and mitigate this in the debrief. One place where I have seen this come up in the hobby space a little bit is games that are sort of making an explicit argument. Amabel, you made the point, like you didn't want people to miss the message when you opened up this guilty land with slavery is bad, right? I mean, that's, you don't want any ambiguity around these things. I wonder if sometimes folks not accidentally, but may not feel the need to be as explicit about their message up front. And the message gets missed in part because some of the audience wants to misuse the tool for delivering the message, but also may actually wave away some of it as, oh, that's just a satire. They're actually on our side. We're just, they're doing this to make fun of something. So that's a long way around. Cole, what do you think of Rex's comments here?
I'm gonna unmute myself first is what I'm going to do. I think it's a great point. And satire is in particular a very difficult. I think that there's sort of a few tools I would want to put in conversation when it comes to how these games do their argumentation. And we might think about metaphor, which Annabelle talked about earlier, and also literary devices like satire. One of the tricky things about John Company is the game uses a moderately satirical framework, but it's really adopting the narrative conventions of 19th century novels. And that's to give players like a little bit of alienation, which Annabelle also talked about. And there are liabilities to doing that, right? I don't want, I want players to feel sort of sunk in the different roles that they're inhabiting in the game, but that can create really uncomfortable situations, which you also have to make sure are properly staged. And I think there are a number of ways that you can do this in the game's physical production, right? And that's one reason why I put up all those pictures of like the Prime Minister dial and things like that. All of the white folks in John Company look gross because I drew from caricatures, and I wanted to draw from caricatures because the game is using this novelistic, satirical print culture way of a society looking at themselves. And so I didn't want players to get a sense that they were doing anything valorous. And one way to do that was in the game's physical production. Now that's a subtle way of doing it. I mean, many people are going to play the game and not know that, but there are more explicit ways too. One of them is putting a sheet of paper in the game before they get to anything else that talks about what the game is doing. This is akin to Annabelle's like slavery is bad line, right? A game that I saw do this recently really compellingly was Tammany Hall from Pandasaurus. The newest printing of Tammany Hall has a little letter in it which says like, hey, you're about to play a game about 19th century politics in New York. Guess what? You're going to talk about ethnic groups. And because that's kind of like, those are the essential cellular unit of politics at that time. And make sure that everybody kind of like is able to build that magic circle around the game, and they know the subject that they're getting into. And John Company has a similar thing with the rule book, where right on the very first page of the rule book, it says, hey, just so you know, this is a game that's going to talk about globalism and empire. And there are lots of reasons why it may not be the appropriate thing. Now, I think that when it comes to content warnings, there's a lot of literature out there about their appropriateness or not appropriateness. I think it's a difficult line, a super complicated subject we could spend all day talking about. But I do think that there's a way that if we sort of drop the words that might cause us to like have the hair stand up on the back of our neck and just think about the degree to which you are framing the intervention. This is akin to, if I'm teaching a class on a particular book, I'm going to have a day before we start reading that book where I talk about what we're about to get into, because I need folks to have a kind of ground that we can use to attack that subject, rather than just saying, all right, class, read the first half of Bluest Eye. We'll start there next week. That's not fair to anybody. And so I think that kind of framing is really important, but it also is, and I'll say something I said earlier, this is just a place where what you want the game to do will change depending on how the game's being done. Experiencing one of these games as a hobbyist is very different from experiencing it in an institutional setting where you are playing a game to derive specific lessons. And recognizing the differences in context can create a different framework and can allow the game to do a lot more work. It's your turn to be muted, Brant.
Yeah, it is. I was trying to be polite and keep on mute. Kevin, you've been nodding seriously at several of those comments. You want to jump in here and give us some thoughts?
Well, it pains me to be on a panel with Cole because he's so damn smart. So I just have to agree with most of what he says. But to what Rex was saying, I think something else, this isn't really for the hobby wargaming, but this is for professional wargaming, is to remember that your games are not actually predictive. And what you're trying to do is think through a situation. So if something like it does happen, at least you've thought about it before, but don't take the results as like, oh, well, this is, because I've been seeing lots of articles here in DC about, oh, well, this has been predicted in wargaming. And that's just, that is dangerous, because just because something worked in a war game or didn't work in a war game, that's based on a whole bunch of assumptions that the people running the game are making. And so I would like to see not only the Defense Department, but all of the other aspects of the government here in DC do a lot more of wargaming, the way we're kind of using it as a broader term, but recognize that it has limitations, and don't drink the Kool-Aid too much, I guess, is all I was going to say.
Yeah, that's something we covered in the very first session for Connections Online this year, the introduction to professional wargaming, the idea that these things are not and never should be considered as in any way predictive of specific events or actual events, especially in the professional context, right? Root is not predicting who's in charge of my backyard with all the critters out there. And, but to the same degree, the kinds of professional games that we're looking at, one of the things that's very important to get across is they are not predictive in if you do X, Y will happen. What they can offer the insights are, in order to make the best decision about X, you need the following information as demonstrated by what you know about setting conditions within this game for best chances of success. And so not necessarily that if you do all of these things, you're going to automatically succeed. But if you consider all of these things, you're going to make a better decision toward that success. So, Amabel, anything you want to throw in here?
No, I agree with all that.
All right, fair enough. Tracy Johnson had a good comment in here that we were going to throw up there. Wife gave me one of those 2-minute anti-war lectures last night on this conference because of the serious national security discussion. How do you address that? Do you get that from associates? In terms of, hey, some of these games are actual like conflict combat sorts of games, or have other fairly impactful lessons to them on the political side. Amabel, did you have to deal with this guilty land, even though you had the billboard in there that said slavery is bad? And we'll throw this to Cole and Kevin on their games as well.
So I mean, I did. There were some varied reactions to the game. I did have some folks who felt that making a game on the subject itself was inappropriate. I did try to stress when the game was coming out that this was about the political discourse and discussion and the structural issues behind it, and not about the lived experience of slavery, because as a white person, that is not my story to tell at all. And I've had people who were upset that the game existed in terms of just discussing the issue at all, because they'd rather not discuss it, frankly. And that's just something I try to anticipate and try to be very careful how we were framing discussions of the game to try to mitigate that. And it's not for everyone. And we try to be very clear that the game is not for everyone, and don't engage with it if you don't want to engage with it. Yeah, I'm not sure that exactly answers the question, but that's what I got.
I imagine you and Kevin probably have some similar experiences around the voting games also. Kevin, what do you got there?
Sure. Well, I was going to go in a tiny bit different direction.
Yeah, absolutely.
I recognize there are just some topics that don't interest some players. So, particularly during the pandemic, my primary gaming partner was my wife. And we played, we've actually counted, we played over 300 times. We played Dune Imperium. We played Terraforming Mars something over 600 times. I know these are games she'll play. She won't play Twilight Struggle. She doesn't want to deal with the chance of nuking the world. She's not interested in that. And I don't think this is only a gendered response. I think it's like just different people have different interests, and you have to recognize that if you want a broader game to be more palatable, you have to either approach war, like, because I think the poster was originally talking about anti-war in a game, or incorporate that anti-war as part of the broader discussion of the war game. I hesitate to go to one of our unpublished designs, but in the Halls of Montezuma, the Mexican player isn't just the Mexican government, but also the anti-war movement in the United States. Now, is that enough to convince someone to want to play a game who, if they're just explicitly anti-war, maybe not, I don't know. But I think if we kind of broaden how we conceive what we want to talk about, there's at least a hope that more people will be interested. So.
Yeah, this is something I feel like this is a point that I find myself thinking about a lot. My wife is a Quaker and comes from a family of Quakers, and I think a lot about their faith and practice, and deeply admire it. But I'm not. I have a different kind of political framework that treats armed forces differently, and I think when I'm working on, and at the same time, the game that I play most commonly with her is Command and Colors Napoleonics. We actually play a lot of war games together. And they're always stories, or there's enough historic distance. So obviously something is happening with historic distance that's making these things palatable, right? And I can sense, and I think this is true based on the comments that both of you offered, that there is this intuitive sense that there are certain stories that one shouldn't tell or can't tell. And I always think about, the chief criteria for a design I'm working on is always urgency. And urgency has to do with the state of the discourse, but also with the state of one's own expertise. Do you know enough to say anything worth saying? That to me is the main thing. And if you don't know enough, are you willing to put in the work? And to me, so many of the problems happen when someone says, hey, I do want to do a game about a lived experience that isn't my own. And to me, the fundamental problem is the next step where they say, well, I'm not actually going to put in the work that it requires. And they also might not be comfortable with the possibility that the work that is required might be well beyond them for any number of reasons. And I don't, I'm not going to get philosophical and say whether or not it's ever right for someone to make a game about something that isn't their lived experience. But I do think that it is, in most situations, it is possible to put in the work, but that often the amount of work that you need to put in is tremendous. So at the same time, I think that games offer a level of abstraction and distance that can be quite powerful. And I've been struggling with the design on the Reconstruction period for now a few years. And it isn't something I'm actively working on, but it's something that I work on often, just kind of, in a kind of passing way. And I had a conversation with a well-regarded wargame designer. And I said, I'm working on this title. I just don't know if it's right. Like, it feels too many of the players are too evil for me to be comfortable making this like object of play. And the wargame designer said, and so I made some comment that was like, I don't know if I can be really comfortable with what I'm asking players to do. And they said, well, you should know that, like, you're not hurting people, you're hurting abstractions. And that isn't to say that that's not important, right? That is important, but it gives you a little bit of a distance. I think that the thing that I find myself getting caught into sometimes is we want to believe that we can act in right ways all the time towards everyone. But doing something evil in a game is not doing something evil. It's doing something evil in a game. At the same time, like, that is something that I think I firmly believe in the abstract and philosophically. But when it comes to practice, there are moments where I say, I'm going to take my foot off the gas. So I recognize that I can I can see the virtue of that belief, but at the same time, I do think that there are limits to it. And I think, when it comes to subjects, my general sense is that there is no subject that is not appropriate for a game, but there are many subjects which might not be appropriate for a particular designer. And to balance those, because like, is there a good game to be made about the current struggle in Ukraine? Almost certainly. And I know no one who has the appropriate vantage point personally to do that game, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. And I think if you look in the digital space with games like This War of Mine, you find people who do have appropriate vantage points and who are telling those kinds of stories.
You mentioned the Ukraine thing, just to throw in a quick podcast plug again. Earlier in this season, right after the war started, we grabbed me and Brian Train and you know, we spent an hour and a half talking about games that we had designed about what were then potential or hypothetical games in the future on Russia and Ukraine, because Brian had designed one back in 2014-ish. I'd done one starting back in 2007. Yeah, Amabel's probably got on the shelf right behind her.
Yeah. So I'm going to say this, Amabel, while you show that. Right when the war broke out, I thought, I really want to pick up that Brian Train game. And I was like, is this in bad taste? And I've had this like moment where I think it's a little too hot, but I do want to use it to learn. But it also feels a little. This is just a personal feeling, and I assure you, I'm going to order it sometime. But I can sense in myself a desire to wait till things cool off, like a measure.
Well, what Brian and I looked at, and what the point of the podcast was we were saying, okay, what did we get wrong? Like, what did we screw up in those designs that are 6, 8, 10, 12 years old, projecting to the future? Based on what we've actually seen, what did we screw up? And the answer is a lot. That's going back to the comment of war games are not predictive. We were not, absolutely not. Kevin, you wanted to jump in there.
Well, I think as a designer, you need to be aware of the games that you should and should not design, or maybe that's not quite, but definitely what Cole says is you need to make sure that you understand the material appropriately. So we haven't done a game on the Civil War, nor do I think we will, or at least not one I'll design, because the best teacher I had in high school was a retired military officer, but he was from the South. He taught U.S. history, and a little bit of that lost causeism seeped into my brain, and I didn't even notice it. And so then as I, started reevaluating my approach to the Civil War, I really had to confront, whoa, I've got some, need to really reevaluate how I approach the Civil War. And because of that, I'm hesitant to look at a game about the Civil War just because I recognize that past failure in myself, and I don't want to propagate kind of lost causism, which I see in almost every Civil War game that's being published now. And so, I guess that's on each own designer to figure out what they feel comfortable doing. But that's certainly something that I've really thought about. And I hope that everybody can be as thoughtful. I certainly think the people on this panel are, but there's a lot of cowboys in the industry who tend to be a little looser with that, I guess.
Oftentimes you can tell just from the titles of some of the games. So, just real quick, Annabelle, I want to throw audience, we are starting to wind down on time. So if you have any questions, absolutely throw them in the chat right now. Let's not wait. We're going to get to what we can before we run out of time, but we do have the Discord channels open. And so you're absolutely free to continue the conversation over there, whether in text or if you want to jump into the voice channel and chat with each other, that's totally fine. I don't know how many, if any of our panel are able to stick around beyond the time they've graciously given us already. But certainly among the audience, absolutely feel free to keep that discussion going. But if you have any last questions, let's get them in right now. All right, Amabel, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that I agree that it's definitely, I don't think there is anything that's off limits for a game, but off limits for certain designers. And it's really sometimes a decision you need to feel like personally, what am I personally comfortable with? Now, granted, some people are personally comfortable with things that maybe they shouldn't be. And that's up for debate there. That's a subject for debate. But certainly, when I thought of doing this Guilty Land, I fought it at first because I knew how difficult it was going to be, and how actually difficult it's going to be for me, because I would have to immerse myself in that period. Oh, thank you. That's very kind. In that period for like a year and a half with primary sources, and it's just completely depressing and demoralizing. And it was very tricky, but I kept feeling compelled especially because of the moment we were in when the game was being designed, the discourse that was going on at that time, that urgency that Cole was talking about. I definitely felt an urgent need to say something, to do something, and that was kind of similar with the vote, which I stayed away from at first because I thought, well, what is this really my story to tell? And then I found out it was my story to tell. So and there are certainly games that I'm, things that I want to exist, but I'm not going to do because I don't feel I'm the right fit for it. But personal urgency is very. I think it's like, why do you need to do this game? A lot of designers now. I design a lot of games. Like I have like 60 published games out there. A lot of designers design fewer games than that, but still, even with me, every game has to count. It has to be something that I'm interested in, that I feel passionate about, that I have something I can say, and not just be just a random thing. So I think that's important too.
Yeah, I want to throw something at the three of y'all as we start to wind this down a little bit. We've talked about a bunch of different sorts of approaches to the game design and thoughts on what you can and should not do and ways in which you can do that. And we've had some great questions from the audience. Knowing that the primary audience of this conference, and quite frankly, any viewers after the fact who are coming to this video once the conference is over and are watching the recording, that the primary audience here we're looking at the practitioner community, right? Folks that are doing this for serious game purposes, whether it's analytical designs, educational training designs, some form of concept exploration or future important decision-making down the line. As they're looking at some of the mechanics and ideas that you've got in your different game designs, some of the ones we've talked about here, or others that they may find when they go start Googling Cole Worley and let's go look them up and figure out what else I can go play from this guy. As they start looking at these things after the fact, is there any one particular overarching thought or one particular great idea that you think is important for them to keep in mind about your designs and the tools they provide for those practitioner purposes? I know that's a little high-minded. Kevin, we'll start with you. We'll work our way around the horn here. Is there kind of a meaningful lesson you want to leave this specific audience with around those designs?
So I do, and upon reflection, it might not be particularly relevant to them, but in game design in general, I think that we should err on the side of games that look beautiful, that are art, because it draws people in and they want to play it and they want to be engaged. And that's why, like, I'm enamored with wood pieces because I think they look good on a beautiful map. I think that we should endeavor to, because I just think it broadens the interest for more people. Now, that being said, perhaps that's not all that relevant to the professional community because, these are $1 million enterprises and they're going to use them once. But I think that presentation matters, clearly not as much as the mechanics and not as much as the argument, but it does matter, and just don't overlook that.
That is definitely a question.
I know this is a crowd you haven't normally engaged with a whole bunch, so this is a little outside where you normally operate.
All right, I'll fill time for you, Annabelle. Okay, so there's one thing that I think that you should do, which is oftentimes when you're wargaming a subject, there's a tendency to decide what is the most important part of the subject and to build the entire wargame around the resolution of that subject, right? Tank supremacy in this particular theater, that's everything, and build the game around it. But I think one thing that I've tried to do in my own design practice, and this is a reaction to a reading of history, is to understand that most conflicts operate on at least two axes. And the first axis is the fight as it stands. And the second axis is a desire to change the nature of the fight. And I think as a general design principle, it can be a very useful lens to put on your work to say, okay, we're having a scrap over this particular issue where we've decided these 3 things are important. But there's this other way where we can change the things that matter. And then that changes the kind of the grounds for the conflict. So I think that when you're approaching subjects, look for ways in which the determination of the ground interacts and often comes at an opportunity cost with fighting on that ground itself. I mean, that's really like that to me is what PAX Premier is about from a mechanical standpoint. And I think that this is just something that I would like to see in more, even traditional war games, the hex encounters and things like that.
All right, Amabel, we're back to you.
I still got nothing. I'm sorry.
It's a hard question.
It's a hard question. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm not trying to be mean to you guys by asking hard questions. You're smart people. I expect you to be able to do this, right? So, but no, again, this is a particularly specialized audience for this conference, and that's by design. That's what we're trying to do, and it is a space in which many of the hobby and commercial games don't operate on a regular basis, and that's again by design, and that's expected. And that's the area where you guys that's your bread and butter. That's where you've had your successes, and that's great. And but it's those successes and those neat and interesting ideas that are the reason we dragged you into this, quite frankly, because there are some good ideas and some neat designs that are useful or can be useful additions to the toolbox for those professionals and practitioners. And that's what we were after. And I hope that's what the audience was able to get out of this. It seems like there's been some really interesting dialogue go on in the chat, even amongst the participants in the chat. I will say that's one of the things I really like about the online conferences. I as much as I enjoy being in a room, being able to go grab lunch together after something like this, one of the neat things about the online conferences is that those side conversations will be happening without distracting the panel necessarily. And that's sometimes kind of cool to watch those unfold. So with that said, I do want to carry and ask an interesting question that I just don't think we have time to fully dig into and answer here. But I think we're going to throw this into the Discord. And so anybody that wants to have a conversation around this in the Discord, absolutely welcome to come over there and join in. We just want to give people an opportunity to catch their breath before the 1:00 panel starts here in a few minutes. But if anybody's got a short answer to this you want to throw out there quickly, we can do that. Or if it's if this is more than a tweet length answer, maybe we go ahead and address this over in the Discord. But I do think this is a good question and certainly worth considering. So in the meantime, Kevin, Amabel, Cole, thank you guys very much for joining us, taking the time, especially in the middle of a workday like this, for taking the time to join us here at Connections Online. And I hope you guys have had a chance to check out some of the other sessions and be able to see some of the other things that are on offer here. And maybe there was some good ideas that you guys can pillage in some of those places. But definitely appreciate you taking the time to be here. I will say, Cole, Root, I've had a bunch of discussions with the guys at Commander General Staff College, and they are not able to be here this specific week because of some academic things happening out there. But they've openly admitted that if Root didn't have cute, fuzzy, pettable critters, they would be able to use it in a ton of their coursework because of the way it models asymmetric conflicts. The problem is when it looks like a petting zoo, it's hard to put that in a military classroom and have people take it seriously.
Well, I'd urge them to take the advice given by Annabelle, I think earlier, to steal liberally and take the ideas that work for you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So again, massive thanks. I know Chris would be saying thank you if he was sitting at his desk, but he's off prepping, getting ready to watch the next panel as well. And so on behalf of the audience, as well as the organizing crowd here, the folks that have been putting this on, you guys are awesome and really appreciate y'all being here. Audience, jump in the Discord. Let's keep the conversation going. And thanks.